We completed our detailed study of the text titled Sri Aurobindo Upanishad, where Sri Aurobindo concludes by describing us as children of the bliss, who, having attained to that oneness, are enjoined to enjoy the divine bliss and enjoy the one enjoyable divine in all things. How exactly this is to be accomplished is the theme of our study in reading the 2 chapters from the Life Divine, titled Delight of Existence, the Problem, and Delight of Existence, the Solution. In the solution, Sri Aurobindo presents to us a different way of looking at the universe, which is a triple perspective, a triune view, in which this material appearance of form of the universe is to be seen first as a movement of force, and this vision is relatively easy to see and is what science sees when it says the whole universe is pure energy. But then he says that force and its movement is itself nothing but the continuous throwing up in changing rhythms of the creative consciousness projecting itself, its own deeper truths, into this appearance of force and movement. And then the rhythm of that creative consciousness is itself a play of the infinite delight of being, busy with its own innumerable self-representations. So science looks at the form of the universe and says, this is created by movement of energy, the force. But Sri Aurobindo goes 2 steps further. The movement of this force is itself a creative self-expression of a consciousness, and the rhythms that the consciousness throws out are rhythms of its own deeper delight. And now he says, the correction we have to bring in our own view of ourselves and our relationship with our experience of the universe is this, the first step. Since then, eternal and immutable delight of being moving out into infinite and variable delight of becoming is the root of the whole matter, we have to conceive one indivisible conscious being behind all our experiences, supporting them by its inalienable delight and effecting by its movement the variations of pleasure, pain, and neutral indifference in our sensational existence. So it is this being which is a being of delight, throws out into the movement of becoming a variable delight. That is, the delight is not a blank, flat, but a constantly varying movement. And this is one single being, one indivisible conscious being. And this is the truth not only of ourselves individually, but it is the truth of each one of us. And behind each one of us, it is the same one being. It is also the truth of the whole universe. And at the base, behind the appearances, is this one indivisible conscious being. And it supports us, all of us, and the whole universe by its inalienable delight. And because of its movement of delight, on the surface, we have the variations of pleasure, pain, and neutral indifference in our sensations. And this is the idea that we have to imprint in ourselves deeply, reminding ourselves of this truth again and again. When we view our own life experience, our own sensations, whether material or mental, we have to see that behind this is this one indivisible conscious being who is always delight, who upholds us and the whole universe by his delight. And the sensations we have, pleasure, pain, indifference, are only the superficial registrations, and they are not the reality. This idea has to permeate deep within, and automatically it begins to change how we respond to things. And then, that deeper being we have to see as our real being. And this mental surface person is only registering an imperfect response of its true rhythms. That is, in every experience, although we may experience pleasure, pain, or indifference, behind that within us and in the universe is the true rhythms thrown out from that one indivisible conscious being, the true rhythms of its delight. But here on the surface of our mind and our senses, it is an imperfect registration of the rhythms. And therefore we have this discord. And gradually, as we proceed, as that true rhythm emerges, we will experience the full symphony in this surface experience also. Sri Aurobindo then describes two great consequences of this vision. The first, that all of our sensational experiences are only a superficial arrangement. The true person within is always in delight. And therefore it is possible for us to shift our mind inwards, concentrate in our depths, and then look upon these superficial experiences as something distant which does not disturb the depths of our silence, peace, or delight. And we are aware that deep within us, it is the Lord Himself, the Divine, supporting. And whatever may be the surface nature of the experience, we align ourselves to that deeper reality. This is the first consequence which comes out of this vision. The second consequence builds on this first and takes us deeper. It recognizes that the reason why we respond to a particular contact with pleasure, pain, or indifference is entirely a habit. A habit particularly in our nervous being, to some extent in the mind, and of course most deeply entrenched in the body and its nerves. But it is a habit, and as a habit it can be changed. We can learn to give back a different response instead of pleasure, pain, indifference. And the different response can become increasingly a response of that inalienable delight which is the truth deep within. And this means that we bring forward the truth within and bring it into expression outside. How is this to be done? And this is what we are now reading. Sri Aurobindo has pointed to three layers: the mind proper, the nervous being, which is the more vital, emotional, sensory-based consciousness within us, including parts of the mind, parts of the life instinct, and resting on the nerves. And then the most material part, the gross physical and nerves itself in the biology. And he says the main problem is this habit in the nervous being, where we have this fixity that this experience is associated with that response. So for example, failure and defeat is an unpleasant response. Victory and success is a pleasant response, and so on. But it is still an enslavement to habit, and this response can be changed. On the other hand, he says the mental being is more free. It is able to modify the response, and even though our first nervous reaction is to say, this is unpleasant, the mind can stand back and philosophize and say, all right, I will learn from this. It is a learning experience, and it's not so bad. It has its good side. So the mind is able to do this because it is in fact the tool that nature uses to exercise the freedom of consciousness. Whereas this nervous being is the device nature created to establish a commonality a fixity, a permanence, and a commonality between all of us, that we all experience the same thing in the same way to begin with, so that we have a basis to relate with each other. So the first implication of this is, the more we refuse to be dominated by the nerves and the body, draw back from the implication of oneself in the physical and vital parts, the greater is our freedom. Sri Aurobindo uses this word implication. The more man draws back from implication of himself. An implication here, in its original sense, is to entangle. Weave in the threads until the threads are fully entangled. And the experience is like this. When first you taste an unusual food, you will find your whole being stands back, not getting involved. Just in case it is a sharp, violent, negative reaction, I don't want to be overwhelmed, so I take a little bit, and you see the tongue and the lips move a little bit, tasting, and then the whole tension relaxes. You say, it's nice. But till then, you were in this tension of standing back and observing. And then it's nice, your consciousness moves into the nervous sensation, and maybe even it's delicious, and then your consciousness identifies with the sensation, immerses itself in it, and that is the indulgence, the entanglement, the implication of oneself. We become one with the sensation, we are the sensation. And at that moment, you can be sure the opposite reaction will soon follow. The moment in life you identify with a sensation or with an experience, losing yourself, the opposite will follow soon after. So you have the high of excitement, the high of pleasure, and immediately after the reversal and the low, the collapse, the fall, the negative reactions. Because it is, in a certain way of looking at it, nature or the universe teaching you not to get entangled. Or we look at it another way, we got so entangled with this that any shift in it produced now pain instead of the pleasure. And because that was pleasurable, the pain now is sharper. You will recall the earlier discussion that Sri Aurobindo makes. The so-called neutrality is only the level status of the divine delight behind. Because it is there effortlessly, we register it as neutrality. If there is a burst above, like a wave, then we see it as pleasure or pain. But it subsides into neutrality to the sensational mind. And it is this which happens when we entangle ourselves. There is a burst of something intense followed by its very opposite, because the circumstances change. So the first training is to refuse to be dominated by the nerves and the body. How exactly the whole thing will develop, we will see shortly. But then he says, to the physical body, the handling of pleasure and pain is more difficult, because here the habit is so deeply entrenched, and it is the seat in us where we connect to the whole external world. But he points to how under hypnosis, it is easy for us even to turn pain into pleasure, or even make it neutral. Even a burning sensation is neutralized and continues after the hypnosis is removed. And the reason he gives is because at that point the habitual waking consciousness is suspended. The nervous habits to which we are slave are no more operating, and rather there is a call to the inner being, the subliminal mental being, who is master, if he wills, of the nerves and the body. Now this process of calling, appealing to the inner mental being is done in yoga by a conscious approach, gradually and in a normal state of consciousness. Whereas the hypnosis does it in an abnormal way, in a brief abnormal situation. But this is possible for us, and it is allied to the earlier practice of standing back and not losing ourselves in the experience. I have observed often in little children, very young children, before they have been fully programmed in their habitual responses, The child is running in great excitement, he trips and falls, and he just looks stunned for a while, gets up, he notices some sharp sensation, but he's looking around. At that moment, the adults rush and say, "Oh, what happened? What happened?" The child looks at their face and then starts crying. He learns from them that he's supposed to respond with agitation, where earlier he just had a sharp bump and he looked at it kind of stunned for a while. And then afterwards, when the parents are cuddling the child and saying, "Oh, poor fellow," he's not concentrating on the pain. He's crying to get the sympathy, and he's enjoying the cuddling and the attention that he receives. And you see a lot of the children behavior molded by the wrong response that adults teach. In fact, they don't seem to have such a rigid attachment to this habitual response as adults have. We have learned to look at what we are supposed to do and respond with what we are supposed to do rather than enjoy the thing in itself, as he will tell us briefly, shortly. Now, the role of pain and pleasure, he has said, was necessary at a certain stage of evolution, and as the mind comes into its own, it has to be conquered. And the elimination of pain and pleasure is possible because, he says, ultimately, both are currents of the delight of existence. Everything is a current of the delight of existence. And so it is possible to stand back from both and go back to the essential truth behind. And he introduces the term rasa from the Sanskrit aesthesis, which means at once sap or essence of a thing and its taste. And this double meaning is extremely important. We have seen in our earlier study of the Sanskrit text repeatedly, Sri Aurobindo uses the word bhoga to describe the experiencing of the world, the enjoyment of the world. And we saw how this bhoga, which is the enjoyment by the psychic being of the world experience, has a double sense. It is not only experiencing, but it is also drawing nourishment, taking in food and growing from it. And you see in the term rasa, there is this double meaning, essence or sap, and the other is taste. So when the true being in us experiences the world, it is as if tasting the world experience. But in tasting, it is drawing the essence, the sap, by which it nourishes itself. In Sri Aurobindo's own practice, which is described and recorded in his record of yoga, you will find this term rasa grahana, which literally means taking in of the rasa. And he describes how the rasa grahana becomes more and more perfect. That means in all experiences, his concentration is on the taking in of the true sap, the rasa. And when we are taking in the rasa, the surface being, when it is not taking it perfectly, it experiences shrinking and with it grief and pain, or it experiences craving and with it desire and fear, or it experiences neutrality. And the neutral, indifference, he says, is inability to seize the essence. When we cannot seize that, we experience as neutral, but the rasa is still there. And then, if we could be entirely disinterested in mind and heart and impose that detachment on the nervous being, the progressive elimination of these imperfect and perverse forms of rasa would be possible, and the true essential taste of the inalienable delight of things in all its variations would be within our reach. So this is the next practice that we have to introduce in our life, that we must learn to be entirely disinterested in mind and heart. We begin, of course, with the mind. Gradually that spreads into the heart. But then we must impose gradually that disinterestedness on the nervous being. And from there even it can go into the material body and its sensations. But as that happens, the distorted registrations of rasa begin to subside, and we can begin to taste that true essential inalienable delight in all its forms. That is, every single experience, however painful, pleasurable, or indifferent, is only variation of that delight. There is nothing in this world which is not variation of the delight. And everything, every experience can be taken in this way. He gives the example of how we can have a little bit of this in the mind, in the aesthetic experience of things, where even in a play or a movie, because we are not struggling with our own survival, we are quite detached, we can even enjoy sorrow, terror, horror, and disgust as variations of a delightful experience. But a similar liberation has to come in all the parts of our being. So now, how is this to be attained? The specific practice and means is presented to us. The logic of this is, the real problem is that we are unable to face the impact from the world. The conscious force in us fails when it meets the shocks of existence. And when it fails, it shrinks. Observe how sometimes people have this, they are on a high and they say, I will do this, I will do that. They rush into battle. Suddenly they get overwhelmed by the shocks and pain and then shrink back. And then they say, never again. So the reaction is of this excessive shrinking and contraction when the shock was too intense, because we could not meet the intensity with our own conscious force. And this inability comes from the self-limitation by egoism, because the consciousness has been cut off, and is no more complete, is no more whole. And that itself comes because of our ignorance of our true self, of the Satchidananda behind. In other words, because we have been cut off from our true self, we are now this little person on the surface struggling against a whole humongous universe. Eventually we find ourselves overwhelmed and begin to shrink. So now, if this is the true cause of things, then, he says, the first thing required is we must substitute titiksha, the facing and enduring and conquest of all shocks of existence, and substitute this titiksha for jugupsa, the shrinking and contraction. That is, instead of shrinking and contracting, we must face, endure, and conquer, at first impassively, to all contacts. So he says, by this endurance and conquest, we proceed to an equality which may be either an equal indifference to all contacts or an equal gladness in all contacts. So the next step, first you simply bear. You don't allow the normal reaction. You try to impose the greater calm of your mind on the emotions, on the sensations, even on the body, to not react, to not get carried away, either positive or negative, and develop an equality in this forbearance. So for example, you're walking, you're in a hurry, your knee bumps against a sharp object, and normally you'll have a whole reaction, oh, ouch, and fall over, call for help, make a big scene, make a lot of noise. And you can begin to rationalize. Does my making a noise with my mouth help to reduce the pain? No. Does my flailing my arms make a difference? No. Does my observing the pain make a difference? Doesn't really help. Can I turn my attention away? Can I detach from the pain? You begin by observing your own responses and begin to modify them. And at some point you'll find, by rationalizing, bringing in the status of the mental observer, you disengage from the sensations and nerves. And at that point, the whole relationship with the pain changes. I remember when I was 12 years old, it had happened that I burnt my finger with a soldering iron from some carelessness. and it was paining. The pain was throbbing with such intensity, it was overwhelming. The mind was getting agitated. And of course, there was the idea of putting ice and all that. Then I said to myself, but what is this pain truly? After all, we have been taught it's nothing but sensations of the nerves. The burn has already taken place on the skin, it's not going to get worse. It's only the pain which is increasing, and pain is nothing but electricity in the nerves. It has no other reality. So can I change my relationship with it? And I stood back from it and observed. And the interesting thing was, I found the pain increasing. The reaction, of course, of the mind and the will imposing forbearance on the body was impassive. And then it peaked and suddenly stopped. And then there was no pain. The whole thing healed. I had to put nothing else. It healed over a few days normally, but there was no further pain at all. And it was an enlightening experience because it showed that had I gone on doing the usual things, the pain might have lasted a few hours and come up again and again. But if we change the relationship once and for all, it stays. It was the same outcome which would have happened under hypnosis to somebody else, which was imposed here consciously by the mind and the will on the nervous being, the nerves, and even the body. And so in this first forbearance, creating an equal indifference to all contacts, we bring gradually into it an equality. We don't have to struggle anymore. There is a leaning back into an equality of something that remains unaffected, while the surface may be affected more or less. But then he introduces something very important. In the equal indifference, you can bring an equal gladness in all contacts. Once you are equal to all things, you can introduce something which then remains equally also for all things. And what you introduce now is a gladness. Oh yes, this is fine. This is a new learning experience. This is part of my world experience, and there is the divine presence within me, around me, in these things, in the experience itself. And a gladness gradually suffuses. The equality itself can be a mental equality, but then he says gradually, in this equality again, and this equality again must find a firm foundation in the substitution of the Satchidananda consciousness, which is all bliss, for the ego consciousness, which enjoys and suffers. So the equality itself must lean back to the underlying true one blissful being. To what extent one is able to attain to it is not so important, but the very effort to turn in and feel it or rest in it already makes a huge difference. It as if flows through the whole being, a kind of a calm or a peace, and there is a spontaneous, effortless equality that sustains without the initial forbearance and tension of our effort. And we can remain like that in some deep part in us and gradually bring that more and more in the more superficial parts, until even though on the surface we have pleasure, pain or indifference, the bulk of our conscious awareness is suffused with this equality and perhaps even a gladness. In another example which I have shared before, I was undergoing surgery on the foot, and it was excruciatingly painful on the foot in spite of the anesthetics, and the arms, the legs were all in great pain from other devices attached. And after struggling with the pain for a while, I said, this is not the way. There's a new lesson to be learnt here. And then I focused myself on the mother, invoking her, and then trying to feel her touching in the foot, where earlier it was a scalpel cutting it painfully. I visualized, felt, called her into that experience. And it was astounding that within a few seconds, the whole sensation changed. And there was only this peaceful, joyous, even delightful touch of the caress of her fingers on my foot. And I suddenly began to laugh because it was such a beautiful experience and it was so simple in a way. So in the integral yoga, one of the three principal realizations is the perception of the mother's presence in all things. And if in this practice that Sri Aurobindo is describing, we draw that principle, the perception at first in the mind or the heart, by the love in the heart as a bhakti, a devotion, or the mind perceiving, visualizing, or understanding in its thinking, we begin to perceive the mother's presence behind the forms, within all experiences, within ourselves, and we see her receiving the impact of the experience. We feel her taking the burden of our pain or suffering, and we leave it to her rather than ourselves carrying it. Subjectively, we find ourselves released from a great stress, where earlier we were carrying this weight and burden. Now we release it and let her carry it, although it's still in us, but she's carrying it. And we dwell instead in her consciousness, in her joy, in her gladness, in her bliss. And the whole experience changes. As also this can be imprinted in the sensations, but it can be brought also on the other side at the cause and the source of our sensation. The thing which caused the pleasure and pain, we begin to see it as her movement, her consciousness flowing in and through that object, her force meeting her force in this experience of the sensation. And you find the sensation transmuted as if the husk falls away and the deeper rasa begins to fill. And this is the practical means by which this transition and substitution of the Satchidananda consciousness can be brought into the ego consciousness. At that point we forget ourselves. We are lost in her, and the ego person thins and fades. But in this approach, there are still two variations possible. He describes them like this. The Satchidananda consciousness may be transcendent of the universe and aloof from it. And to this state of distant bliss, the path is equal indifference. It is the path of the ascetic. So this is the first approach where we say the Satchidananda is far away. And so we bring in the equality here, we bring in the indifference, and our focus is on that far away. And this is the way of the ascetic, but it is not our way. Our way, which he describes next, is also the path of the Vedic sages. And he says, or the Satchidananda consciousness may be at once transcendent and universal. And to this state of present and all-embracing bliss, the path is surrender and loss of the ego in the universal, and possession of an all-embracing equal delight. It is the path of the ancient Vedic sages. And it is this which we practice when we begin to perceive the mother's presence in all things, including also in ourselves and even in the sensation. With the mind, we imprint this idea that the Satchidananda and the presence of the Divine Mother is not something far away, transcendent alone. Of course, it is also transcendent, but it is equally universal, it is equally deep within us, individual. And so the method there is self-surrender and loss of the ego in the universal. And through that, possession of an all-embracing equal delight. But in either case, the first step is common, and that is neutrality to the imperfect touches of pleasure and the perverse touches of pain is the first direct and natural result of the soul's self-discipline. And the conversion to equal delight can usually come only afterwards. So the first step is this neutrality. And pleasure we see as imperfect touch, pain we see as perverse touch, but both are distortions. Behind is the rasa, within is the true enjoyer. So having established the neutrality first, then the equal delight can begin to fill. This is the normal way. There is another way which he mentions in passing, but it's very difficult. The direct transformation of the triple vibration into Ananda is possible but less easy to the human being, suggesting in his wording that it is easier for the divine beings. For the human beings, it's not so easy. But it is still possible as a principle. And of course, in Sri Aurobindo's case, we know that once he had realized this consciousness, he was able to make also the direct conversion. And when he had his accident where the thigh bone broke, it is the single most painful experience that the human body can have. And at that point, the thigh bone had shattered. And he said, for a moment, he found that he could not convert that into the Ananda. It was too intense for the body. And it took him a few seconds to make the correction within to be able to deal with that level of intensity. And he could still then transform it into Ananda. But this is an aside. The point being that it is possible in every experience down to the most material to perceive this rasa and the underlying Ananda. And it is our destiny, in fact, to experience this. He gives a summary in the next paragraph of the steps we pass through, that the all blissful pure self-consciousness moves into a varied play of force in the movement of Prakriti. And at first, that delight of existence is self-gathered, absorbed and subconscious in the physical universe. Then it grows into a great mass of neutral movement before sensation appears. Then with life and mind, there is the growth of the triple vibration of pain, pleasure, indifference. And then, as the consciousness emerges into full Satchidananda, by universality, by equality, by self-possession and conquest of nature, once again we recover the Ananda which is in the origin of things, and that becomes now manifest in the individual life. This is the course and movement of the world. And this now completes the solution for the practice. And we come back to the question with which this whole discussion started: why? Why at all should have that divine bliss chosen to experience this contrary condition? Now we can see that the contrary condition of pain, pleasure, indifference is only an appearance. It is a distortion. Even it is a transitional passage in our own development and evolution. But why at all allow for that? Why at all include that in the universe? And the next two paragraphs with which he closes the chapter are very beautiful because it answers this finally and then describes the true character of this whole evolution from the perspective of the delight of existence. So I will mostly read through it, pause only where something significant needs to be elaborated. He says, if it then be asked why the one existence should take delight in such a movement, the answer lies in the fact that all possibilities are inherent in its infinity, and that the delight of existence in its mutable becoming, not in its immutable being, lies precisely in the variable realization of its possibilities. So for the full delight of existence to be manifested, all variations should have been included, including this variation of negation, concealment and contradiction. So, and the possibility worked out here in the universe of which we are a part begins from the concealment of Satchidananda in that which seems to be its own opposite, and its self-finding even amid the terms of that opposite. Now he describes what happens when that self-loss takes place and the emergence takes place, but he positions it from four different perspectives: from being of Satchidananda's Sat, consciousness, force of consciousness, and then Ananda. From all four perspectives, what is happening? Infinite being loses itself in the appearance of non-being, and emerges in the appearance of a finite soul. So, what was infinite being appears here as this empty, vacant space where you say there is nothing, non being. And out of that, gaseous matter, liquid, solid matter emerges. Out of that, life forms, human and conscious soul emerges out of nothingness. And that's the miracle. Then, infinite consciousness loses itself in the appearance of a vast, indeterminate inconscience and emerges in the appearance of a superficial, limited consciousness. What was earlier this indeterminate, no consciousness of the flat, empty space in the universe, suddenly out of that, this little center of consciousness wakes up and says, I am awake, I am alive. And what is this universe? What am I doing here? But it's a finite, superficial, limited consciousness. Then, infinite self-sustaining force loses itself in the appearance of a chaos of atoms and emerges in the appearance of the insecure balance of a world. So what was infinite force? Having lost itself in that chaos, suddenly out of that cosmos, organized, ordered, structured world emerges. And we say, where did this universe come from? Then, infinite delight loses itself in the appearance of an insensible matter and emerges in the appearance of a discordant rhythm of varied pain, pleasure and neutral feeling, love, hatred and indifference. And finally, the fifth position he brings in, which is not part of the chain of Satchidananda, but it is the underlying unity. Infinite unity loses itself in the appearance of a chaos of multiplicity and emerges in a discord of forces and beings which seek to recover unity by possessing, dissolving and devouring each other. And this is the nature of the world. All these infinite little beings continuously possessing, dissolving and devouring each other. Even down to the subatomic realities, this is the truth. A subatomic particle captures another, merges to become something totally different, breaks apart, rejoins with another. In the amoeba, you see similarly how the bacteria eats up another bacteria, recreates itself by splitting, rejoining, merging, exchanging DNA across each other. And in us, of course, in more structured beings, the same process happens. Everything eats everything else to survive. And that's the way by which we as if possess, dissolve, and devour. In this which has emerged, which is this finite consciousness, finite soul, limited appearance of an insecure balance of a world, and this struggling of discordant rhythms. In this creation, the real Satchidananda has to emerge. Man, the individual, has to become and to live as a universal being. His limited mental consciousness has to widen to the superconscient unity in which each embraces all. So the next step is the fulfillment of this initial appearance. An individual soul now must recover his universality, and all are in him. Each embraces all. His narrow heart has to learn the infinite embrace and replace its lusts and discords by universal love. And his restricted vital being to become equal to the whole shock of the universe upon it and capable of universal delight. So here is the great secret. It is only when your vital being is universalized and can equal the shock of the entire universe impacting on you, then you are capable of universal delight. This is the great secret of the experience of universal delight here. And that's why all that initial training is mostly in the vital consciousness to forbear, to become strong, etc. But you see, first, the mind has to widen so that it can embrace all. The heart has to widen and experience universal love. The vital being has to be able to experience the whole universe impacting upon it. Because this is the reality. At each moment, it's the whole universe which hits. And then the most physical part in us, his very physical being has to know itself as no separate entity, but as one with and sustaining in itself the whole flow of the indivisible force that is all things. So the body experiences itself as a knot in the one universal flow of force. His whole nature has to reproduce in the individual the unity, the harmony, the oneness in all of the supreme existence, consciousness, bliss. In other words, that universal Satchidananda has to now be represented in the individual Satchidananda. Through all this play, the secret reality is always one and the same delight of existence. The same in the delight of the subconscious sleep before the emergence of the individual, in the delight of the struggle and all the varieties, vicissitudes, perversions, conversions, reversions of the effort to find itself amid the mazes of the half-conscious dream of which the individual is the center. And in the delight of the eternal superconscient self-possession into which the individual must wake and there become one with the indivisible Satchidananda. So in this vision, you're seeing the delight on these three levels. It is the same delight in the subconscious sleep before the individual emerged. This is the first step of Vishnu. It is the same delight in the individual's experience and struggle to find himself in the mazes of the world experience. But it is still the delight that is playing out, and this is the second step of Vishnu. And then the third step, which is now preparing in human evolution, is the emergence of the individual waking up into and recovering the one and indivisible Satchidananda, and Vishnu completes his journey and bridges the whole domain of reality. So this is the play of the One, the Lord, the All, as it reveals itself to our liberated and enlightened knowledge from the conceptive standpoint of this material universe. So he is saying, this is the last sentence, he is saying how this is how we see when we look at things from the perspective of the material universe with our understanding, with the enlightened knowledge. The whole vision can be seen differently from above and in other ways. But this satisfies the intellect, gives us a very practical base of practice by which now to recover what we see to be the deeper truth of things, and points to the immediate unfolding evolutionary priority. So this is delight of existence, the solution. And with this background now, when we review the text, we will see how it literally encapsulates all of this discussion in the series of 19 sutras, aphorisms, and we will review the full text rapidly from this background next time, and we will close the study with that. But for now, we can just read the last 4 aphorisms where all that we have discussed is encapsulated on the practical side. And maybe the last 5. By deliverance from ego, one is delivered from ignorance. By deliverance from ignorance, one is delivered from suffering. Knowing that I am all blissful, He am I. I am one. I am infinite. I am all. one becomes all blissful, one becomes a being of bliss. This alone is liberation. The liberated one enjoys the enjoyments of all. Enjoying all joys infinitely, he is not separated from finites. Enjoying finites, he is not reduced from infinity. He becomes one, he becomes many. Although unborn and is as it were born. Even being born, he is not born, is not bound. He has no birth. In the self by self am radiating self. By this knowledge liberated, he plays. For Leela indeed, for play indeed, is the world. He has become playful for joy. Therefore be engaged in Leela, O sons of bliss. Being united, play, enjoy the bliss. Having attained the one enjoyable divine, enjoy him in all things. As commanded by the divine, I shall only expound the bliss. Removing obscurity, radiate the bliss, you who are its children. We can meditate on this for 5 minutes.